In the early years of World War II, the German Luftwaffe ruled the skies over Europe. Their Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s were fast, agile, and deadly. German pilots were confident, even arrogant. They had faced British Spitfires, Soviet Yaks, and American P-40s. None had truly scared them. Then came the P-47 Thunderbolt. When American pilots first arrived in Europe with the P-47, German aces scoffed. The plane was huge, almost comically so. It looked like a flying milk jug, bulky and slow. Luftwaffe pilots joked that it must be a bomber, not a fighter. They called it the Jug and laughed at its size. But they didn't know what was coming. The P-47 was powered by the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine, a 2,000-horsepower beast that gave it incredible speed in dives and unmatched durability. It could absorb punishment that would shred other planes. And it carried a terrifying payload, 8 half-inch machine guns. That's right, 8. Each wing held 4 Browning M2s, capable of firing over 100 rounds per second. When a P-47 opened fire, it didn't just shoot, it unleashed a storm of lead. German pilots who had laughed at the Thunderbolt quickly learned to fear it. The first encounters were brutal. Luftwaffe fighters dove in, expecting an easy kill, but the P-47 could dive faster than anything in the sky. It could take hits and keep flying, and when it returned fire, it tore through enemy planes like paper. One German ace described it like this: "I thought I had him. Then he turned, and the sky exploded." American pilots began flying bounce missions, diving from high altitude, unleashing their guns, and climbing away before the enemy could react. The P-47's firepower was unmatched. Its rugged frame could survive flak, bullets, even mid-air collisions. Suddenly, the Luftwaffe wasn't laughing.
The P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't elegant. It wasn't sleek. It didn't dance through the sky like a Spitfire or slice through clouds like a Messerschmitt. It was a brute, a flying brick with wings. But that's exactly what made it terrifying. Weighing over 10,000 pounds fully loaded, the Thunderbolt was one of the heaviest single-engine fighters of the war. Its massive radial engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800, gave it raw power. It could climb fast, dive faster, and absorb punishment like no other aircraft. German pilots quickly learned that shooting down a P-47 wasn't easy. Its thick armor protected the pilot. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing. Its airframe could take hits from 20-millimeter cannons and keep flying. One pilot returned to base with over 200 holes in his fuselage and lived to fly again. But the real terror came from its guns. 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing, gave the Thunderbolt unmatched firepower. Each gun could fire 850 rounds per minute. Together, they unleashed a torrent of lead that could shred enemy aircraft, trains, trucks, and even tanks. American pilots used this firepower to devastating effect. In bomber escort missions, P-47s tore through German fighters. In ground attack roles, they strafed convoys, destroyed bridges, and disrupted supply lines. The Luftwaffe began calling them Jabbo, short for Jagdbomber or fighter bomber. The Thunderbolt's dive speed was legendary. German pilots who tried to follow it down often lost control or tore their wings off. The P-47 could dive at over 500 miles per hour, then pull out and climb back to altitude before the enemy could react. Its nickname, the Jug, became a badge of honor. American pilots loved it. They knew they could take risks, survive hits, and deliver punishment. The Thunderbolt wasn't just a fighter, it was a flying fortress, and the Luftwaffe began to fear it.
By mid-1943, the skies over Europe were changing. The Luftwaffe, once untouchable, was now facing a new kind of enemy, one that didn't flinch, didn't break, and didn't back down. The P-47 Thunderbolt had arrived in force. American bomber crews flying daylight missions over Germany had long suffered devastating losses. German fighters would swarm their formations, picking off B-17s and B-24s with ruthless precision. The U.S. needed a protector, something that could escort bombers deep into enemy territory and fight off attackers. Enter the Thunderbolt. With its massive fuel tanks and rugged design, the P-47 became the backbone of bomber escort missions. Flying high above the formations, Thunderbolt pilots scanned the horizon for enemy fighters. When the Luftwaffe appeared, the sky erupted. German pilots still underestimated the Thunderbolt. They dove in, expecting sluggish turns and easy kills. But the P-47 had learned to fight smart. American pilots used altitude to their advantage, diving with gravity, unleashing their 8.50s, and climbing back before the enemy could respond. The results were devastating. Luftwaffe formations were shredded. B-109s and FW-190s were torn apart mid-air. The .50 caliber rounds didn't just damage, they obliterated. Wings snapped, engines exploded, pilots bailed out if they were lucky. One German ace described it bitterly. "We used to own the sky. Now we fear it." Thunderbolt pilots developed new tactics. Dive, fire, climb became the mantra. They didn't dogfight unless necessary. They struck hard, fast, and disappeared. The Thunderbolt wasn't graceful, but it was lethal. Ground crews began painting kill marks on the fuselages. Some pilots racked up dozens of victories. The Luftwaffe began to avoid direct engagements. Morale dropped. The tide was turning, and the Thunderbolt was leading the charge.
By late 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolt had proven itself in the air. But its true terror was just beginning on the ground. As Allied forces pushed deeper into occupied Europe, they needed more than air superiority. They needed a weapon that could destroy German convoys, tanks, trains, and infrastructure. The Thunderbolt was ready. Its 850 caliber machine guns were already devastating in dogfights, but when aimed at ground targets, they became instruments of chaos. Trucks were shredded, locomotives exploded, infantry scattered. The Thunderbolt didn't just strafe, it annihilated. American pilots began flying fighter bomber missions. They loaded their P-47s with bombs, rockets, and fuel. Then they dove low over enemy territory, unleashing destruction with surgical precision. German soldiers called it Der Fliegende Tod, the flying death. Convoys traveling by day became suicide runs. Bridges were blown apart. Ammunition depots erupted in fireballs. The roar of a Thunderbolt engine became a warning: run, hide, or die. One pilot described it like this: you could see them scatter like ants. Then you drop the hammer. The Thunderbolt's durability made it perfect for low-altitude attacks. It could absorb flak, small arms fire, even near misses from artillery. Pilots returned with shredded wings, scorched paint, and bullet-riddled fuselages, but they returned. German commanders began shifting supply movements to night. They camouflaged roads, they hid tanks in barns, but it wasn't enough. The Thunderbolt hunted relentlessly. In Normandy, during the D-Day invasion, P-47s flew hundreds of sorties. They destroyed tanks, softened defenses, and cleared paths for Allied troops. Infantrymen on the ground cheered when they saw the Jug overhead. It meant help was coming. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, was now grounded. Their airfields were bombed, their fuel was scarce, their pilots were outmatched. And the Thunderbolt ruled the skies and the roads. By 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had become more than a fighter. It was a juggernaut. Its reputation stretched from the skies over France to the forests of Germany. Wherever it flew, destruction followed, and the Luftwaffe knew it. The Allies were preparing for the biggest operation of the war, D-Day. Air superiority was critical. The skies had to be cleared of German fighters. Roads, railways, and bridges had to be crippled. The Thunderbolt was called in. In the months leading up to the Normandy invasion, P-47s flew thousands of sorties. They bombed rail yards, strafed convoys, and hunted enemy aircraft. German pilots who once mocked the Jug now dreaded the sound of its engine. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt. They flew in tighter formations. They used flak traps. They even tried to lure Thunderbolts into ambushes. But nothing worked. The P-47s were too fast, too tough, and too well armed. One German squadron lost 60% of its aircraft in a single week. Thunderbolt pilots became legends. Names like Francis Gabby Gabreski, Robert S. Johnson, and Hubert Zemke filled the headlines. These men weren't just pilots, they were warriors in the sky. Gabreski alone scored 28 kills in a P-47, making him the top American ace in the European theater. The Luftwaffe was bleeding. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, and relentless Allied pressure were taking their toll, and the Thunderbolt was at the center of it all. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, P-47s flew over the beaches of Normandy. They strafed bunkers, bombed artillery positions, and cleared the way for Allied troops. Infantrymen on the ground cheered as the Jugs roared overhead. The Thunderbolt wasn't just a plane, it was a symbol of American power, resilience, and vengeance. It had gone from a laughingstock to a legend. And the Luftwaffe was running out of time.
By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer laughing. The P-47 Thunderbolt had become a nightmare, not just in the air, but across every battlefield it touched. German pilots dreaded its silhouette. Ground troops feared its roar, and commanders scrambled to adapt to its relentless presence. The Allies now controlled the skies over Western Europe. Thunderbolts flew in massive formations, sweeping across France, Belgium, and into Germany itself. They escorted bombers, hunted fighters, and obliterated anything that moved on the ground. The Luftwaffe was bleeding out. Fuel shortages crippled their operations. Replacement pilots were rushed into combat with minimal training. Airfields were bombed daily, and every time a German plane took off, a Thunderbolt was waiting. American pilots had mastered the art of aerial warfare. They flew with confidence, precision, and overwhelming firepower. The P-47's 8 50 caliber guns were no longer just weapons, they were symbols of dominance. One pilot described it like this: "You didn't just shoot, you erased." Thunderbolts began flying fighter sweeps. Missions with no bombers, no distractions, just pure hunting. They dove into enemy airspace, looking for targets, and when they found them, they struck like lightning. German pilots tried to fight back, but their aircraft were outgunned, outflown, and outnumbered. The Bf-109s and FW-190s were still deadly, but the Thunderbolt was unforgiving. In one famous engagement, a squadron of P-47s encountered a group of German fighters over the Ardennes. Within minutes, the sky was filled with smoke, fire, and falling wreckage. The Americans lost one plane. The Germans lost 12. The message was clear: the sky belonged to the Jug. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Its aces were dead or grounded. Its planes were scarce, and its legacy was being rewritten, not by German steel, but by American thunder. But his journey wasn't over. By early 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its end. The Allies were closing in on Berlin. The Luftwaffe was broken, and the P-47 Thunderbolt had earned its place in history, not just as a weapon, but as a legend. American pilots who flew the Jug spoke of it with reverence. It wasn't just a machine, it was a lifeline. It had saved them in dogfights, brought them home through flak storms, and given them the firepower to change the course of battles. The Thunderbolt had become a symbol of American grit. Its massive frame, once mocked, was now admired.
Its 8.50 caliber guns were feared across Europe, and its pilots, many of them farm boys, mechanics, and college dropouts, had become heroes. Stories spread through airfields like wildfire. One pilot returned with half a wing missing. Another flew home with no hydraulics, using only trim tabs. A third landed with over 300 bullet holes and walked away smiling. The Jug could take it, and it could give it back. Ground crews loved it too. It was easy to maintain, hard to kill, and always came back. They painted nose art, patched bullet holes, and loaded ammo with pride. The Thunderbolt wasn't just a plane, it was family. In the final months of the war, P-47s flew deep into Germany. They bombed factories, strafed trains, and hunted the last remnants of the Luftwaffe. The skies were theirs. And when the war ended, many pilots wept, not just for the victory, but for the plane that had carried them through hell. The P-47 Thunderbolt had started as a joke. It ended as a legend. The war ended. The guns fell silent, the skies cleared, but the roar of the P-47 Thunderbolt never truly faded. In museums across America and Europe, the Jug still stands, massive, proud, and battle-scarred. Veterans walk past its wings and remember. Historians point to its frame and tell stories. Children stare at its guns and ask questions. The Thunderbolt became more than a machine. It became a memory. Its legacy lives in the numbers. Over 15,000 built, more than 7,000 enemy aircraft destroyed, countless ground targets eliminated. But its true legacy lives in the hearts of those who flew it and those it protected. Pilots who once sat in its cockpit now sit in wheelchairs, telling stories to grandchildren. They speak of dogfights, flak storms, and the feeling of diving at 500 miles per hour with 8 guns blazing. They speak of fear and of courage. The Jug was their shield, their sword, their home in the sky. In Europe, the wreckage of German fighters still lies buried in forests and fields, silent witnesses to the Thunderbolt's fury. In Normandy, veterans gather each year to honor the planes that cleared the way. And in the skies above, restored P-47s still fly, their engines growling, their wings gleaming. The Luftwaffe never recovered. The Thunderbolt helped break its back. But the story isn't just about victory. It's about transformation. A plane once mocked became a legend. A pilot once afraid became a hero. A war once lost became a lesson. And the Jug still flies, in air shows, in memories, in history. Its 850s no longer rain lead, but its thunder still echoes.